happen to live on these islands, but these are real people who have different concerns than city folk.
And a little bit different cultural aspects, yeah.
So it was a fun read. That was a lot of fun. I mentioned previously The Goblin Emperor. We
you
talked
did.
about that. And I enjoyed it, but I was glad I also had it as an audiobook that I could listen to simultaneously, because it taught me how to pronounce a lot of these very weird naming conventions.
Yeah, that's what you were saying, that the naming conventions were a big part of the culture.
Yes.
And you had to wrap your brain around that and really...
And in that sense, the world building and the cultural aspect was brilliant. The plot was a little straightforward and predictable.
Okay.
And I actually want... Now, when a book wants me leaving more, I guess that's a good thing.
Right.
From what I can tell, the subsequent books aren't going after the things that I want to know more about. Although she does take one of her more interesting characters and gives him his own narrative.
Right.
But I also kind of want to find out about some of these other characters, and I hope she goes back and delves
Circles
deeper
back,
into
yeah.
that. Yeah. I got into books by Tessa Harris. And these are set in Britain in the early 1880s.
So
late
historical
1870s.
fiction? Or?
It's historical murder mystery is what it is. But they focus on an American expat who's in London and is an anatomist. So in those days, that was not always a reputable trade. He teaches at the medical school. He's a very young man, and he's gotten a very prestigious position for his age. But he's using what we would consider modern forensics to solve these murder mysteries, except this is, very, very basic. This is the early days of even anatomy, much less forensic science.
Right.
And so he's using a knowledge of herbs and plants and his knowledge of anatomy and poisons to try to solve these mysteries. The Dead Shall Not Rest was a particularly good one because it deals with historical people. And there was a very unfortunate man, John Hammersmith, who probably had pituitary giantism.
Oh, okay.
So he was the Irish giant. Mm-hmm. He was only in his early 20s. He died before his 30th birthday because of hormonal difficulties. But he's being exploited, and he was shamelessly exploited by promoters, and then ultimately fell in with an anatomist in the London schools who wanted to study him. Promised him, got him away from the carnival scene, but really then just exhibited him to a higher class clientele to pay for his own experiments. So, they're interesting books.
You like that? I do have a recommendation for you if you haven't read it, The Killer of Little Shepherds. And I don't remember who wrote it, but it's the birth of forensics in that era and how that progressed. So I highly recommend that if you're into that sort of thing, that you look at that one. Pick that one up.
So that's about it. I read some fun stuff, some fanfic from, I don't want to call it fanfic. I guess it's tie-in fiction for Firefly.
Oh, okay.
That was fun.
Well, let's see. The most recent things I read this summer that I really enjoyed were Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher.
Working my way through.
There's something about that dark fantasy aspect and the twists that they put on it. And we'll talk about it when you're done reading it then, because we won't talk about that tonight. When you're done reading it, I want to have a conversation with you about that. I also read Hild by Nicola Griffith, which is about St. Hild. And she took some license to fill in some of the blanks, but she used a lot of authentic records and historical documents to kind of piece together the life of this young woman. And it was dense because it's historical fiction, but it was fascinating to me because it was that era when the British Isles were shifting from paganism and into more of the Christianity, and that overlap, and how the kings were convinced to do that by the priests, and how the priests were a communication network because they could write and send messages. But even more than that, it was all about the women's side of things and the work that they did and how they operated. And, they ran the wool trade and the weaving and the dyeing, and, they managed the households.
What is this time frame?
So this would have been, I want to say, gosh, now you're going to nail me to the floor, but I want to say 600.
Okay. So before the Viking incursions.
Yeah, right. Before that.
So
when the English were called the Anglish, and and the Welsh were considered, there was another name for the Welsh, and that sort of thing. So it was that era before. Yeah.
This is before really the establishment of the four main English kingdoms, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
It was around that time. Yeah, it's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So fascinating book, and I guess there's more. So I'm looking forward to reading more of that.
I will have to look that one
So
up.
it's called Hild by Nicola Griffith. I also read The Grimrose Girls by Laura Paul, which is about a school where girls are dying, and the reason that they're dying is because they are somehow tied to fairy tales. So that was a really interesting twist on taking the fairy tales and then twisting them around into and how these girls were dying, and then they have to solve the mystery of why that's happening. So I enjoyed that. And then I also read Amari and the Night Brothers by B.B. Alston, which is a middle grade.
I've heard of this one. Yeah.
It was good. It was different. It was good. It's a girl whose brother disappears because he starts to work for the magic, basically the underground. They're not the underground, but they run all the magic, and they hide all the magical beings and that sort of thing, and they're in charge of all that. And he was one of their top agents, and he disappears, and then she gets kind of brought into that. So I enjoyed that. I thought it was a fun adventure. It was different. It was refreshing. And the last one I want to talk about is Lost in the Neverwoods by Aidan Thomas, which is a kind of a twist on the Peter Pan story. And while, I liked Cemetery Boys better, which is also an Aidan Thomas book, I enjoyed Cemetery Boys better. I just really engaged with it more deeply. I still enjoyed Lost in the Neverwoods, and I liked the twist. And the darkness of the twist really surprised me at the end of the book. So I do recommend it for anybody who's a Peter Pan person or who likes that kind of stuff, because, I wrote Lost and Found, which takes elements of Peter Pan, and so I really wanted to read this book. So I've been kind of finding some of these books that are those books.
You keep telling me Lost and Found is Peter Pan, but it's Oliver.
It's both. It's Peter Pan, Oliver Twist, and steampunk. It's all kind of mashed together.
The Oliver elements just come through to me much more strongly than, other than your little mechanical fairy.
Oh,
Yes, I love Quacks, but
yeah,
this is Oliver. It's just,
It is in so many ways, even from the opening scene, I know, but I loved writing that book. So, and I didn't want to adhere too closely to the Peter Pan elements, but I wanted to use the elements that included clacks and some of the other details that we put in the steampunk. I wanted to include those as part of it. So, yeah, that was a lot of fun to write. So those are the things that I've been reading. I did read one other thing. I read a memoir called Bomb Shelter by Mary Laura Philpott. It's Bomb Shelter, Love, Time, and Other Explosives. And I really, really engaged with this particular book. It starts with her son having a seizure. And then it follows through what their family had to go through and deal with around his medical condition and him wanting to play sports and having to deal with all of these different things because he was